The sirens cut through the night, their wail a shrill reminder of a city caught in chaos. The streets of Yekaterinburg were thick with smoke, thick enough to obscure the flames rising from the wreckage of a collapsed shopping center on Bolshoi. Within minutes, emergency services had swarmed the scene, fire trucks blocking the street, police forming barriers around panicked onlookers. But it was in the heart of the disaster where the true story would unfold. Start with the perimeter. Wait for the specialists, the protocol echoed in the minds of the first responders. Yet, as they gathered in their usual indecision, she appeared. Dressed simply in jeans and a t-shirt, her presence was unexpected. No uniform, no badge, just a quiet authority that none could deny. Even Romanov, the senior paramedic, had seen it all. Gang violence, explosions in the industrial districts, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed next. She moved with practiced precision, checking vitals, assessing victims with a calmness born of experience, not of training. "Who is she?" whispered his partner Yulia as they watched the woman work with an almost eerie focus. She hadn't even hesitated. A woman in her 30s, with steady hands and unflinching eyes, stepped into the gap left by trained responders, too slow to act. Ivan's eyes narrowed. He moved toward her, about to intervene, when she began to stabilize a victim on her own. His mind reeled. No one had authorized this woman to do anything, least of all save lives. The elderly grandmother, crushed by debris, was in grave condition, her breathing shallow. But instead of waiting for a trauma surgeon, she inserted a needle, a procedure Ivan only knew from the most advanced combat medical training. A needle decompression, a technique reserved for military medics. Ivan froze. He had seen combat surgeons perform such procedures under fire, but never in a city mall. But this woman, she worked without question, every movement calm and deliberate. "She's not even supposed to be here," Yulia muttered under her breath, her gaze locked on the woman's focused expression. Ivan could only watch as the woman did what none of them thought possible, saving lives when every second counted. As the woman worked, Ivan's mind raced. She wasn't a paramedic. She wasn't a medic at all. Her movements were too quick, too sharp. She knew this kind of trauma intimately. The woman glanced up briefly. Her eyes locked with Ivan's, cold, distant, a lifetime of unspeakable memories reflected in them. She gave him a single nod before returning to her work. And with that, she sealed her place in the chaos of Yekaterinburg's most harrowing night. Ivan's training told him to be cautious. His instincts told him to step aside. And yet, something about the way she worked made him question everything. Who was she? Where did she come from? And more importantly, why was she here, doing things that no one else dared to? This was no ordinary emergency response. This was something else entirely. She was something else, a woman who had crossed invisible boundaries between civilian and soldier. A woman who, when the world was at its darkest, had no hesitation in stepping into the breach and saving lives. Ivan realized then, he wasn't the one in control of this scene anymore. She was. The chaos continued to spiral, but the woman was a calm center in the middle of it all. Ivan had never seen anything like it. Victim after victim, she worked with military precision, knowing exactly what to do without hesitation. When it came to the young mother trapped under debris, her pulse weak and erratic, most would have stuck to standard procedures, but not this woman. She did something Ivan had only read about in military medical journals, combat care techniques that went beyond civilian norms. While the other paramedics looked on in disbelief, Ivan found himself following her orders without a second thought. Start an IV, large bore, 2 units O negative, and a chest tube kit. Now. The words sliced through the noise, and Ivan's hands moved before his brain could process what was happening. This wasn't an emergency response. This was a combat mission, a mission she was clearly prepared for. The woman worked relentlessly, undisturbed by the growing pile of bodies, the hopelessness around her. She's saving them, Ivan realized. She's saving them all. Her skills were beyond civilian medicine. She was a combat medic, a field surgeon, and perhaps more than that. Ivan knew he had to learn who she was. But when the city officials arrived, looking for someone to blame, she became a shadow in the storm. "I did what had to be done," she said calmly when asked about her actions, her voice a perfect blend of authority and resignation. "The procedures I performed were outside the scope of civilian care. But those people would be dead if I hadn't acted. The officials exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to handle someone so unafraid of the consequences. The woman, now known to them as Irina Petrovna, former Russian military medic, had acted beyond the law, and yet no one could argue with the results. She had saved every life that night, but in the eyes of the law, she was a criminal. Ivan could sense the fear in the air, the creeping judgment. Irina's unregistered, unsanctioned actions were a threat to everything the city's bureaucracy stood for. But even in that moment, as the fire chief prepared to question her, Irina remained unfazed. "I was a soldier," she said quietly. "When the world falls apart, you don't have time to wait for permission." There was something in her words, a hidden story that Ivan was desperate to understand. He had to know why she was here, why she chose this moment to act. As the night wore on, the injured were transported to nearby hospitals and the scene began to settle. But Irina slipped into the background, fading into the shadows like she had never been there. Ivan wasn't satisfied. He needed more. "Why did you come here?" he asked as she gathered her things, preparing to leave. She stopped, turned, and met his gaze, those eyes, so deeply worn, so familiar in their unspoken sadness. "Old habits," she said. Her voice softened, but the weight of her words carried a finality that Ivan couldn't ignore. She had been a soldier, a medic in places where soldiers died daily, where there were no rules. And now she was here, saving lives without any permission, without any recognition. She wasn't looking for accolades, she was looking for redemption. Ivan didn't fully understand, but he couldn't ignore the truth in her eyes. She wasn't just a woman, she was someone who had lived through unimaginable hells and come back to help when others would hesitate. There was a reason she chose to be there. Fate had brought her to Yekaterinburg that night, and her actions would leave a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed them. Even as the officials questioned her, trying to find fault in her methods, Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that Irina Petrovna had saved more lives in one night than most could even dream of in a lifetime. The morning after the disaster, Yekaterinburg was a city in recovery. The shops reopened, and the city slowly began to reclaim its rhythm. But the events of the previous night left a lingering unease. Ivan Romanov sat in the dimly lit office of his paramedic unit, staring at the report in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to Irina. She had come out of nowhere, acted without authority, and saved lives. But at what cost? The legal ramifications were still hanging over them. She had performed procedures that no civilian was allowed to do. A needle decompression, a chest tube insertion, advanced combat medicine that had no place in a city disaster. And yet, the patients were alive, and that truth made the legalities seem insignificant. Ivan had tried to contact Irina the morning after, but she was already gone. She had disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the memory of her actions behind. He felt a strange sense of loss, a void that only grew the more he thought about her. "You've got a lot of questions, don't you?" Yulia asked, her voice breaking his concentration. Ivan looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yeah, more than I can answer." "She saved them," Yulia said quietly. "Every single one." Ivan nodded, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, but it's not that simple. She broke rules, Yulia, big ones, and we're the ones left to deal with it." Yulia hesitated, her eyes lingering on the report in front of him. "She didn't do it for us, Ivan. She did it for them." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but there was a softness to it. A recognition of the truth that Ivan wasn't ready to face. As the weeks passed, the case was quietly swept under the rug. The city's legal system was nothing if not adept at closing ranks and protecting its own. The investigation into Irina's actions was marked with bureaucracy, red tape, and endless delays. But there was something else at play, something Ivan couldn't shake off. He began to dig into Irina's past, a past that wasn't so easily erased. He found records, buried deep within the military archives. A woman named Irina Petrovna had served as a combat medic with the Russian Special Forces. Her file detailed multiple deployments, places where soldiers like her had faced unimaginable horrors. Syria, Afghanistan, Chechnya. Her file wasn't marked with accolades or commendations, it was marked with scars. The kind of scars that never fully heal, the kind that turn people into something else. Irina wasn't just a medic, she was a soldier who had survived the worst of humanity. And now, she was here, in the streets of Yekaterinburg, saving lives when no one else could. Ivan knew he had to find her. He had to understand the person behind the legend, but Irina remained elusive. Every time Ivan thought he had a lead, it vanished, like smoke in the wind. She was a ghost, a memory from a past too painful to face. But Ivan wasn't the only one searching for answers. Yulia, too, had begun asking questions. She had spent hours in the library, researching military protocols, looking into the methods Irina had used. And while Ivan focused on the official investigation, Yulia followed a different trail. The truth was, Irina's actions had shaken them all. It wasn't just the legality of it. It was the fact that someone had walked into their world, someone from the outside, and done what they couldn't. She had saved lives in ways they could only dream of. And that truth was a wound none of them were ready to admit. The deeper Ivan dug, the more he realized that Irina wasn't just a hero. She was a reflection of everything they had failed to become. She was a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules, and sometimes it meant sacrificing your own peace for the sake of others. As Ivan walked out of the office that evening, he felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He wasn't just a paramedic anymore. He was part of a much larger story, a story of duty, sacrifice, and the cost of saving lives. Irina Petrovna had taught him that. Weeks passed, and life in Yekaterinburg slowly returned to normal, but the memory of that night remained etched in Ivan's mind. He couldn't shake the image of Irina working with the calm authority of someone who had been through hell and back, doing what others couldn't even begin to fathom. As Ivan went about his usual routine, his thoughts often returned to her. She had appeared out of nowhere, like a phantom from the past, someone who had carried with her the weight of 1,000 battles. He had begun to realize that the truth behind her actions wasn't just about saving lives, it was about something far deeper. Irina wasn't just a medic. She was a soldier who had fought in the most brutal theaters of war. Ivan found himself studying military documents, reading about the special forces training Irina must have gone through, the kind of training that turned ordinary people into experts at surviving in the worst possible conditions. He learned about the special forces medics who were taught to perform surgery under fire, to stabilize wounds with whatever they had on hand, to make life and death decisions in seconds. And suddenly everything about Irina's actions began to make sense. She wasn't afraid to break the rules because she had learned long ago that in war rules didn't save lives. People did. Ivan knew that if he ever saw her again, it would be a confrontation. She had saved those lives without a thought for consequences, and yet now she was a criminal in the eyes of the law. But more than that, she was a ghost, a woman who had buried her past so deep that it was impossible to reach her. Irina had disappeared into the shadows after that night, and no one had heard from her since. Ivan couldn't stop thinking about her. He found himself wondering if she would ever come back to save someone again, if she had already moved on from Yekaterinburg, from everything she had left behind. There was something about her that felt unfinished. A story that hadn't reached its conclusion. One evening, as Ivan walked through the streets of the city, he spotted her. Irina. It was brief, just a flash of her figure disappearing into an alley. But it was enough. He followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. She had been living in the shadows all along, watching from the periphery. She wasn't ready to face what she had done. Ivan approached the alley cautiously, his breath catching as he rounded the corner. And there she was, standing against the wall, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach, but the moment he stepped into her line of sight, her posture stiffened. Irina looked up at him, her eyes revealing nothing. "What do you want, Ivan?" she asked, her voice calm but tired. It was as if she had known he would find her, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "I need to understand," Ivan said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken question. "Why did you do it? Why didn't you wait for the authorities, for the proper response teams?" Irina looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she spoke. "Because people were dying, and I could save them." Her words were simple, but there was an underlying sadness in them, a quiet resignation that Ivan could feel in the air between them. "You don't understand," she continued, her gaze hardening. "I've seen people die. I've seen them die because the system couldn't help them in time. because the rules didn't allow it. And I swore that if I ever had the chance to help, I wouldn't hesitate. I couldn't let those people die when I had the skills to save them. Ivan could see the weight in her eyes, the years of guilt, the scars that had never healed. She had been through something that no one could understand unless they had lived it. Irina wasn't just a soldier, she was a survivor who had fought in places where the lines between right and wrong were blurred, where the rules didn't apply, and the only thing that mattered was the difference between life and death. "You broke the law," Ivan said, his voice softer now. "You put yourself at risk." Irina didn't flinch. "I did what I had to do," she replied. "And in the end, it doesn't matter what the law says. What matters is that those people are alive." Ivan stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. Irina was right. The law, the protocols, they weren't enough to save lives. Not in the face of real danger, real suffering. And yet the world couldn't operate like that. Rules were there for a reason. But what if, in the heat of the moment, those rules were the very things that got people killed? "You're a hero," Ivan said quietly. Irina shook her head, her expression unreadable. "I'm no hero, Ivan. I'm just someone who does what needs to be done." Ivan didn't know what to say. He had never met anyone like her. Someone who carried the weight of so many lives. Someone who didn't seek glory or recognition, but simply acted because it was the right thing to do. And now, standing in front of her, Ivan understood. She wasn't afraid of the consequences because she had already paid the price. Irina had seen the worst of humanity and survived it. And in that survival, she had learned the most important lesson of all. When lives are on the line, nothing else matters. Not rules, not laws, not even redemption. Only the people you save. Days passed, and the tension in Yekaterinburg grew. Irina had vanished again, and life had returned to its usual pace. But Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that he had uncovered only a small part of her story. He had spent days trying to find her again, hoping for some kind of closure, but it seemed like she was always just out of reach, a ghost haunting the city. The authorities, too, had kept their distance. The case had been quietly closed, with a few unanswered questions lingering in the background. Officially, the disaster response had been handled according to protocol, and the victims had received the medical attention they needed. Irina's actions had been swept under the rug, her name erased from the records. It was a quiet conspiracy of silence, a shared understanding between the people who had witnessed her heroism. It wasn't legal, but it was right. Ivan knew this. He had seen it in her eyes. The way she carried the weight of her past, the scars that were invisible to anyone who hadn't experienced war. She had done what no one else could, and she would pay the price for it. But there was one thing Ivan couldn't forget. The words Irina had spoken to him in the alley still echoed in his mind. "I did what I had to do." It wasn't just the disaster that had driven her, it was something much deeper, a past filled with choices and regrets, with lives lost and lives saved. And now that past had caught up with her. Ivan spent weeks piecing together what little he knew. Her military records were buried deep, but slowly, with the help of his contacts in the service, he uncovered more. Irina had been a special forces medic, a Green Beret deployed to some of the world's most dangerous conflict zones. The details were sparse, but the shadow of her service hung over everything she did. She had been to Afghanistan, Iraq, and places no one spoke of. She had saved lives, but she had also lost them. And it was clear that the weight of those losses had never left her. Ivan wasn't the only one interested in Irina's past. The city's legal system had finally caught up with her, and they were preparing to take action. She had violated civilian medical protocols, performed surgeries without certification, and used military-grade equipment without authorization. But no one wanted to confront her directly. They didn't have the courage. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about fear. Fear of someone like Irina, someone who had the power to disrupt everything. The fear of what she represented. A person who had stepped outside the boundaries of the system and done what needed to be done. Ivan knew that the city couldn't allow someone like Irina to exist in the shadows. She was a threat to everything they stood for. The rules had to be enforced, even if that meant tearing down the only person who had acted when the system failed. But Ivan didn't want to see that happen. He knew that Irina's actions, while illegal, had been the right ones. She had saved lives, and that was all that mattered. It wasn't about following the rules, it was about saving people when no one else could. As the legal proceedings loomed, Ivan felt a sense of urgency building within him. He had to find Irina before they did. He had to understand her fully, to find out why she had chosen this path. Was it redemption? Was it guilt? Or was it simply the only way she knew how to survive? One evening, as Ivan sat at his desk, sifting through more documents, he received a call. It was Yulia. Her voice was tense, urgent. "Ivan, you need to come here. I think I know where she is." Ivan's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" he asked, his pulse quickening. "Meet me at the old hospital on Kirova Street. We have to hurry." Ivan grabbed his coat and headed out, the cold air biting at his skin. Yulia was waiting for him at the entrance of the abandoned hospital, her face tense with anticipation. "She's here, Ivan. I know it." They entered the building, the eerie silence of the empty corridors pressing in on them. Yulia led him to the basement, where the air was damp and stale. As they approached a small room at the far end, Ivan could hear the faint sound of someone moving, and then he saw her, Irina, standing by a makeshift table, her hands steady as she worked. The room was filled with medical supplies, some of it civilian, some military. It was clear that Irina had made this place her refuge. She was still working, still trying to save people in her own way. "Irina?" Ivan's voice was soft, unsure. She turned, her eyes narrowing as she recognized him. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, but then her walls came back up. "What are you doing here?" she asked coldly. Ivan took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I'm here to understand why you're doing this, why you can't walk away." Irina's expression hardened. She set down the medical equipment in her hands and crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on him. "Because I can't, Ivan. I can't walk away from this." The words hung in the air between them. Ivan didn't know what to say. He had come here hoping for answers, but now he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear them. Irina's words echoed in the cold, dimly lit room. "I can't walk away from this." Ivan stared at her, trying to process the weight of her statement. What did it mean? Why had she isolated herself in this abandoned hospital, surrounded by the tools of medicine, the remnants of a life she had clearly left behind? Irina's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a vulnerability there, something raw and exposed that she had buried beneath her hardened exterior. "What happened to you, Irina?" Ivan asked, his voice softer now, searching for the truth she had been hiding. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze shifting to the pile of medical supplies she had been organizing. "It doesn't matter," she finally said, her voice tight. "It's in the past. I'm just here to do what I can, to help where I'm needed." But Ivan could hear the cracks in her words. She was lying, and she knew it. He could see the pain in her eyes, the guilt she carried like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about saving lives anymore. This was about redemption, about trying to make up for something, or perhaps someone, she had lost. Ivan stepped closer, his curiosity growing. "Is that why you're doing this? To make up for something?" Irina's face hardened, her features sharpening into a mask of defiance. "I don't need redemption, Ivan. I'm just doing what needs to be done." But there was no conviction in her words. Ivan could see through the facade. She was running from something. "You're not fooling anyone," Ivan said quietly. "You're not fooling yourself." Irina's eyes flickered with a flash of anger, but then she quickly suppressed it, her face once again becoming unreadable. "You don't know anything about me," she replied, her voice cold. "You don't know what I've been through." Ivan didn't flinch. He had seen the same deflection in many people before, soldiers, survivors, people who had lived through horrors they couldn't speak of. But the thing about trauma was that it never stayed buried forever. It always found a way to surface, sooner or later. "Then tell me," Ivan pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "Tell me what you're running from. I've seen it in your eyes. You can't keep hiding." For the first time, Irina hesitated. The mask she had so carefully constructed cracked, just for a moment. "I'm not running," she said, but her voice faltered. Ivan could see the conflict inside her. She was torn between the urge to push him away and the desperate need to share her story. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Irina spoke. "I lost people, Ivan, in Fallujah. Good people." People who depended on me. Her voice was raw, her words coming out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for years. I wasn't fast enough. I didn't have the right equipment. I couldn't save them. Her eyes closed for a moment, and Ivan could see the pain that still haunted her. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to save someone again, I wouldn't hesitate. I couldn't let anyone die when I could do something. Ivan's heart sank. He knew now that Irina's actions weren't just about saving lives. They were about atonement. She had been trained to save lives in the most horrific of conditions, and now she couldn't stop herself from stepping in when others were paralyzed by indecision. She wasn't doing it for the recognition, for the accolades, or even for the legal right to act. She was doing it because, in some way, she thought it would make up for the lives she hadn't been able to save. "Irina," Ivan said gently, "you're not responsible for everything. You can't carry that burden forever." She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment Ivan thought she might say something more. But then she shook her head, the wall coming back up. "I don't need your sympathy, Ivan. I just need to do this." She turned away from him as if the conversation was over. But Ivan wasn't ready to give up. He stepped forward, his voice firm. "You can't keep running from your past. You need to face it." Irina stopped, her back still turned to him. "I don't have the luxury of facing it," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Ivan stood there, watching her, the weight of her words sinking in. Irina wasn't just a woman who had been trained to save lives. She was someone who had seen the darkness of war and had never fully come back from it. And in trying to save others, she was trying to save herself. "Irina," Ivan said softly, "you don't have to do this alone." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, without turning around, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." But when she spoke again, her voice was resolute, as if she had made a decision. "I can't stop, Ivan. I can't walk away. This is who I am now." Ivan understood then. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't looking for redemption. She had already made her peace with her past in her own way. But it didn't change the fact that she was still running, still carrying the weight of every life she had failed to save. And that, Ivan knew, was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. The days that followed were filled with tension. Ivan's thoughts were consumed by Irina. She had told him she couldn't walk away from the life she had built around saving others. But Ivan wasn't convinced. Her past still had a grip on her, a grip that went deeper than any training or skill set she possessed. The city moved on. Life continued, but the specter of Irina's actions lingered in the air. A quiet reminder of what had happened that night. Officially, the authorities had backed off. No charges were filed. The victims, those who had survived, were quietly moved to new locations. Some of them even relocated to other cities to avoid media attention. The whole disaster had become a hushed affair, the kind of thing the city would rather forget. The legal system had been too embarrassed to confront what had happened. Irina had broken the law, yes, but no one could deny the outcome. Lives had been saved, and no one wanted to deal with the mess that came with acknowledging that some things couldn't be handled by bureaucracy. But there was still something unfinished. Ivan knew he needed to see Irina again. He had no idea how, but he needed to understand. She had saved lives, but at what cost? Her actions had been heroic, but there was something underneath that Ivan couldn't shake. Something that didn't sit right. One afternoon, Ivan received an anonymous message. It was simple, cryptic. "Meet me at the old train station, tonight." Ivan's heart raced as he stared at the message. He didn't need to ask who it was from. He knew it was Irina. She had reached out to him, but why? Was it to give him the answers he had been searching for? Or was it a final farewell? That night, he made his way to the abandoned train station on the outskirts of the city. The cold wind swept through the empty platform, and the only sound was the distant hum of passing cars. He scanned the area, waiting, hoping, and then he saw her. Irina stood in the shadows, her face partially obscured by the dim light. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn when he had first encountered her, jeans, a jacket, and a tired look in her eyes. "You came," she said softly, almost as if she hadn't expected him to. Ivan nodded, his voice steady. "I've been looking for you." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a slow step toward him, her expression unreadable. "What do you want from me, Ivan?" she asked, her voice tight. I want to understand, Ivan said, his gaze never leaving hers. Why you did what you did. Why you're still doing this. Irina hesitated, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. She looked at the ground for a moment, as if she were weighing her next words. Because I don't know how to stop, she said quietly. I thought I could walk away, but it's not that simple. Ivan's heart sank. He could see it now. Irina wasn't just haunted by her past, she was running from it, clinging to the only thing that gave her purpose. Saving people. But it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to fill the void left by the people she had lost. You don't have to keep running, Ivan said, his voice gentle. Irina met his gaze, her eyes filled with something raw, something that spoke of years of pain. I don't know how, she whispered. I've been trained to save lives. It's all I know. And when I see someone in danger, I can't walk away. I don't know how. Ivan could see the weight of it in her eyes, the burden she had been carrying for so long. She wasn't just trying to make up for the lives she couldn't save. She was trying to redeem herself. And in the process, she had become a prisoner of her own training, her own instincts. You're not alone, Ivan said, stepping closer to her. You don't have to do this alone. Irina shook her head, her expression hardening. I don't want your pity, Ivan. I don't want anyone's pity. It's not pity, Ivan said, his voice firm. It's understanding. I know what it's like to carry something like this. But you don't have to carry it by yourself. There was a long silence between them, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Irina seemed to consider his words for a moment, her gaze distant. Finally she spoke. I don't know if I can stop, she said quietly, but I'll try, for them, for me. Ivan nodded slowly, understanding. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. Irina had always been a soldier, a medic who had been trained to act when others couldn't. But now, for the first time, she was confronting the reality of what she had become. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. Take care of yourself, Irina, Ivan said softly. You've done enough for others. Now it's time to do something for yourself. Irina met his gaze, her eyes flickering with something like hope. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. She wasn't just saving others anymore. Maybe, for the first time, she was starting to save herself. The days that followed felt like a fragile piece. Ivan continued his work as a paramedic, but his thoughts often drifted back to Irina. She had come to terms with something that had taken her years to face, the weight of her past, the trauma that had driven her to the edge. But Ivan knew that the path to healing wasn't a straight line. There were still days when the ghosts of the past would rise, when the weight of every life she had lost would push her to the brink again. Irina had promised she would try, but Ivan knew better than anyone that promises weren't always enough. People didn't heal overnight, and so he waited. He waited for Irina to reach out, to let him know if she was truly ready to face her demons. But the silence lingered. The days passed, and she remained a shadow in the city's underbelly, moving in and out of places like a ghost, never truly stopping. Then, one evening, Ivan received a call that would change everything. It was Yulia, her voice urgent. Ivan, you need to get to the hospital. There's been an accident. It's Irina. His heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. What happened? He asked, his voice tight with fear. She's in critical condition. They said she was in a car accident, and they found her unconscious at the scene. She's stable now, but they're saying it's serious. Ivan didn't waste a second. He ran to the hospital, his mind racing. What had happened? Was this Irina's breaking point? Had she pushed herself too far? As he arrived at the hospital, he saw Yulia waiting outside the emergency room. Her face was pale, her expression strained. Where is she? Ivan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They're still working on her, Yulia said, her voice shaking. She's stable, but we don't know what else yet. Even I don't understand. She wasn't supposed to be out there. She was supposed to be staying away from this. Ivan's stomach churned. He had hoped that Irina would take the time to heal, to find some peace, but it seemed that old habits die hard. She couldn't stop, could she? Ivan said softly, more to himself than to Yulia. No, Yulia replied, she couldn't. The hours dragged on as they waited for news. Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that Irina had been trying to save someone again. trying to do what she had always done, intervene when others couldn't, and now it had cost her. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his face grim. "She's conscious now, but she's asking for you," he said, addressing Ivan directly. Ivan didn't need to be told twice. He moved quickly to the room, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stepped inside, he saw Irina lying in the bed, pale and battered but alive. Her eyes flickered as they focused on him, and for a moment there was something in her gaze that seemed almost relieved. "You came," she said softly, her voice hoarse. Ivan nodded, walking closer. "I always will." Irina didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, as if trying to reconcile the person who had saved so many with the person who now needed saving herself. "I thought I could handle it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I could keep saving people and not let it break me. But I can't, Ivan. I'm not invincible." Ivan sat by her side, his hand resting gently on hers. "You're not invincible, Irina, but you're human, and that's enough." She looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty, but also something else, a glimmer of hope. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Ivan squeezed her hand. "Now you rest, you heal, and you don't do it alone." For the first time, Irina looked truly vulnerable. The walls she had spent years building began to crumble, and Ivan could see the person behind the soldier, the woman who had spent so much of her life fighting to save others that she had forgotten how to save herself. But in that moment, Ivan knew that healing would take time. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be easy. But Irina was ready to take the first step. She had reached the breaking point, but now she had the chance to rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, this time she wouldn't have to do it alone. As Ivan sat there, waiting with her, he realized that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought on the front lines, they were fought within. And for Irina, the real fight had just begun. Irina's recovery was slow, a process that felt like a constant struggle between the need to move forward and the weight of everything she had carried for so long. Ivan stayed by her side, helping her through the physical and emotional hurdles. But there were moments when it felt like Irina was fighting a battle only she could understand. She had always been the one to save others, the one who stepped in when the system failed, when no one else could handle the pressure. But now, as she lay in that hospital bed, she was forced to confront the reality that she couldn't save herself, at least not in the way she had hoped. Every day, she faced her own demons, flashbacks to the horrors she had witnessed in places like Fallujah and Afghanistan, where the lines between life and death had been blurred beyond recognition. Those memories clung to her like a heavy fog, a constant reminder of the price she had paid for saving others. But slowly, bit by bit, Irina began to open up. She shared the stories of the soldiers she had lost, the civilians caught in the crossfire, the ones who never made it back. She told Ivan about the nights when the only thing that had kept her going was the thought that maybe, just maybe, she could save one more life. But those nights were gone now, and in their place was a new kind of peace, one that Irina had to learn to accept, even if it meant letting go of the past. Ivan stayed with her, offering silent support, but also gently pushing her to face what had happened. "You can't carry this forever, Irina," he would tell her softly. "You have to let go." At first, she resisted. It was as if the weight of her past had become a part of who she was, something she couldn't shake, even if she wanted to. But as the days passed, she began to understand. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean abandoning those lives she had saved or those she had lost. It simply meant accepting that she had done all she could, and now it was time to take care of herself. And so Irina began to heal. She took the first steps, slowly but surely, toward rebuilding a life outside of the shadows of war and sacrifice. It wasn't easy. There were days when the memories would return with a vengeance, when the weight of the past would threaten to pull her under. But on those days, Ivan was there. He didn't try to fix her, didn't try to offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat with her, listened to her, and let her know that she wasn't alone. Slowly, Irina began to find peace. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual shift. She began volunteering at local clinics, helping those who needed care, but this time, it was different. She didn't do it because she had to, or because it was the only thing she knew how to do. She did it because it was a choice, one she made for herself, not for anyone else. As she found her place in the world again, Irina also began to forge new connections with others. She met people who saw her not as a soldier, not as a medic, but as a woman who had lived through things most would never understand. It wasn't an easy road. There were moments when she wanted to turn away, to retreat into the shadows once again. But with each new day, Irina realized that she wasn't defined by the things she had lost. She was defined by the strength it took to keep going, to face the past without allowing it to control her. One evening, months after the accident, Ivan met Irina at a small cafe on the edge of town. She looked different, not just physically, but something about her had changed. There was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, a sense of peace that had been absent before. "How are you?" Ivan asked, his voice gentle but full of warmth. Irina smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I'm good," she said, her voice steady. "For the first time in a long time, I'm good." Ivan's heart lifted at the words. He had seen Irina struggle, had watched her battle her own demons. But now he saw a woman who was beginning to reclaim her life. The war was still with her, in the way she moved, in the things she remembered. But it no longer controlled her. She had found a way to live with it. "I think I'm finally ready to stop running," Irina said, her gaze steady on Ivan. "It's not easy, and it never will be. But I'm ready to move forward. To live, not just survive." Ivan nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "You've always been ready, Irina. You just had to see it for yourself." As they sat there, talking about the future, about the lives they would help, about the people they would become, Ivan realized that Irina had come full circle. She had faced the hardest battles of all, the ones fought within, and had emerged stronger. Not because she had saved everyone, but because she had finally learned how to save herself. Months had passed since Irina had begun her journey of healing, and Yekaterinburg had changed with her. The city's pulse had slowed, its daily rhythm marked by the quiet resilience of people who, like Irina, had learned to face the weight of the past. Irina had found a new purpose, not in the chaos of saving lives under fire, but in the calm work of helping others, giving them the care and compassion she had once given to soldiers and civilians alike. She still volunteered at the clinics, but now she was also starting to teach others, passing on the knowledge she had gathered, not from textbooks, but from years of battlefields, hospitals, and the harsh realities of life. Ivan still visited her, their conversations filled with the same unspoken understanding they had shared from the beginning. He had become more than just a colleague. He had become a friend, someone Irina could count on when the weight of her past threatened to crush her. And she knew deep down that she had come a long way. But there were still days when the ghosts returned. On those days, she would find herself back at the old hospital, sitting in the quiet rooms where she had once treated others with a precision that only combat medics knew. She would sit there, alone, and remember the faces of those she had lost. But she never stayed long. She couldn't afford to, not anymore. Life, as she had come to understand, was fragile, fleeting, and she wasn't going to waste it looking back. As the years went by, Irina became more involved in the community, her past becoming just one part of her story. The people who knew her saw her not as a soldier, not as a medic, but as a woman who had learned to live with the consequences of her actions and was now making the world a little better because of it. And that was enough. It wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about making up for lost time or the lives she hadn't saved. It was about acceptance, about doing what she could, where she was, with what she had left. Ivan had moved on as well. He had found his place in the city, continuing his work as a paramedic, but also helping to mentor the next generation of medics, teaching them not just about medicine, but about the moral weight that came with saving lives. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In some ways, it was his way of honoring Irina, of carrying forward the lessons she had taught him. Lessons about sacrifice, duty, and the quiet strength of choosing to help, even when the world seemed to turn away. One evening, Ivan sat at his desk, reviewing the case files from the day's calls. The light from the desk lamp illuminated the familiar faces of his colleagues on the wall, men and women who had shared in the same struggles, the same victories. He felt a sense of peace now, something he hadn't had before, and in that peace, he realized something that had been true all along. It wasn't the rules, the certifications, or the training that made someone a hero. It was the decision to step into the darkness when others wouldn't. It was the willingness to carry the weight of others' lives without expectation, without recognition. And in that moment, Ivan understood that he had witnessed true heroism, not in the chaos of war, but in the quiet moments of healing. The city had healed, Irina had healed, and in a way, so had Ivan. As the years passed, their paths occasionally crossed, but there was no longer a need for words. Their lives had been shaped by the same experiences, and in that unspoken bond, they had both found a kind of peace. They had done what they could, they had saved the people they could, and in the end, that was enough. Irina's story, like so many others, was one of survival. But it was also a story of learning to live again, of finding meaning in the most unlikely places. And for the first time in a long time, she understood that the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The war within had ended, and the real journey had begun. But this time, she wasn't running. She was walking, with the weight of her past behind her and the future ahead. And for the first time, Irina was ready to face it all. Если эта история тронула вас эмоционально, подпишитесь на наш канал, напишите свое мнение в комментариях и поделитесь этим видео с другими.